The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Alara Whitmore felt every eye in the hall turn toward her at once. She had not asked to be here. She had not asked for any of this. Yet here she stood, on a raised wooden platform in the middle of Ashford Hall, wearing a borrowed gray dress that did nothing to hide how out of place she felt. Below her, hundreds of guests in silk and jewels murmured behind gloved hands, and she could hear her stepmother's voice rising above the rest, sharp and delighted, urging the auctioneer to hurry along. "Lot number 12, the auctioneer called, his voice booming through the hall. "Miss Alara Whitmore, a fine seamstress, they tell me, and a hard worker, who will open the bidding." Silence. Alara kept her chin high, though her hands trembled at her sides. She had known this would happen. She had known the moment her stepmother, Margaret, announced that Alara would take part in the town's charity auction, that it was not an act of kindness. It was punishment. It was humiliation dressed up as generosity, a way to remind Alara, once and for all, that she was worth nothing in the eyes of the world Margaret wanted her out of. The other girls who had been auctioned that evening were daughters of merchants and minor gentry, pretty and polished, trained from childhood in the art of being watched. Bidding for them had climbed quickly, the young men of the town competing for a chance to escort them to the grand ball that would follow. But for Alara, the room had gone quiet the moment she stepped onto the platform. No one moved. No one spoke. Someone near the back laughed, low and cruel, and the sound rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. "Come now," the auctioneer said, forcing cheer into his voice. "Surely someone here can spare a coin for a good cause." A young man near the front, red-faced from drink, called out a bid so small it drew laughter rather than respect. Alara felt her face burn, but she did not look away. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her cry, not here, not in front of everyone who had gathered to watch her be sold off like unwanted furniture. "Going once," the auctioneer said, already reaching for his gavel, eager to move the humiliating lot along and return to the parts of the evening that mattered to the wealthy families watching. That was when the doors at the back of the hall opened. A hush fell over the room, deeper and more immediate than the silence that had greeted Alara. Even the auctioneer paused, gavel raised halfway, as a tall figure stepped through the entrance. He wore a dark coat with no ornamentation, no rings, no unnecessary jewels, and yet every person in the room seemed to shrink slightly in his presence. Alara did not need anyone to tell her who he was. She had heard the whispers for years, though she had never once seen him in person. The Duke of Ashcombe. Alastair Camden had not been seen at a public gathering in over 3 years, not since the death of his father, and certainly never at something as trivial as a charity auction for a country town's orphanage. The wealthy families of the region had spent years trying to lure him to their parties, their dinners, their carefully arranged introductions with eligible daughters. He had refused every invitation. And yet here he was, walking down the center aisle as though he owned the very air in the room, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the auctioneer, but on Alara. "Your Grace," the auctioneer stammered, nearly dropping the gavel, "we are honored. If you'll allow me a moment, we have several fine young ladies yet too." "This one," Alastair said. His voice was calm, but it carried through the hall without effort. "I will bid on this one." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Margaret's face, Alara noticed, had gone pale and then flushed an ugly shade of red. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. Alara was supposed to be humiliated quietly, sold for a laughable sum to whichever fool would take her, and forgotten by morning. She was not supposed to become the center of the entire hall's attention. "Your Grace," the auctioneer said carefully, "the current bid stands at a rather modest sum. Perhaps you misheard the lot number." "I did not mishear anything," Alastair said. He named a figure, and the number was so far beyond anything spoken that evening that a woman near the front actually gasped aloud. It was more than the combined bids for every other girl auctioned that night. It was, Alara realized with a jolt of disbelief, more than her stepmother's entire household earned in a year. For a long moment, no one moved. Alara stood frozen on the platform, certain she had misheard, certain this was some elaborate joke arranged by cruel young men who had grown bored of simpler ways to mock her. She searched the Duke's face for any sign of amusement, any hint that this was a trick meant to raise her hopes only to dash them in front of the entire town. She found none. His expression was unreadable, but it was not cruel. It was, if anything, deliberate, as though he had walked into this hall with exactly this purpose in mind. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his voice now shaking with excitement rather than reluctance. "Going twice. Sold to His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe." The hall erupted into a storm of whispers. Alara heard her name repeated a dozen times over, heard the word plain spoken with confusion rather than mockery for the first time that night, heard someone ask loudly what a duke could possibly want with the seamstress everyone had laughed at only minutes before. She did not have answers for any of them. She barely had answers for herself. Alistair approached the platform and extended a gloved hand to help her down the small set of steps. Alara hesitated, unsure whether to trust the gesture, unsure whether the moment her hand touched his the entire room would erupt into laughter at the joke finally being revealed. But his grip was steady, and his eyes, when she finally met them, held nothing but quiet patience. "You do not have to be afraid," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I did not come here to make a spectacle of you." "Then why did you come?" she asked, before she could stop herself. It was not the kind of question a girl in her position was meant to ask a duke, but the words had left her mouth before caution could catch them. Something flickered across his face, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it vanished before she could be certain. "That," he said, "is a conversation for later. For now, may I escort you out of this hall? I imagine you have had enough of being watched for one evening." Alara glanced past him, at the sea of faces still staring, at her stepmother's furious expression, at the whispers already spreading like fire through dry grass. She thought of every year she had spent in that house, overlooked, unwanted, treated as a burden to be endured rather than a person to be valued. She thought of how easily this could all be some elaborate cruelty she did not yet understand. But she was tired of being afraid. She was tired of shrinking into corners and waiting for the next humiliation to arrive. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin, "please." As they walked together down the center aisle, the crowd parting before them in stunned silence, Alara felt something she had not felt in years, not since before her father's death, not since Margaret had taken over the household and made clear exactly where Alara stood in the family's eyes. She felt seen, not mocked, not dismissed, not overlooked, seen. She did not yet know what the Duke of Ashcombe wanted from her. She did not know why he had walked into a small country auction hall and chosen, of every woman in that room, the one everyone else had decided was not worth a single coin. But as the cool night air hit her face outside the hall, and as she caught the faint scent of rain on the wind, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her life, as she had known it, was about to change completely, and there would be no going back to the girl she had been an hour ago. Behind them, inside the hall, Margaret Whitmore stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her carefully constructed plan for the evening in ruins. She had wanted Alara humiliated. She had wanted her stepdaughter's worthlessness proven in front of the entire town, a final confirmation of everything she had spent years insisting was true. Instead, the opposite had happened, and worse, it had happened in the most public way imaginable, witnessed by every family of consequence in the region. She did not yet know how she would undo this, but as she watched the carriage bearing the Duke's crest pull away from the hall with Alara inside it, one thought settled into her mind with cold certainty. This was not over, whatever the Duke wanted with her plain, unremarkable stepdaughter. Margaret intended to find out, and she intended to make certain it did not last. Alara, unaware of the storm building behind her, sat quietly across from Alistair as the carriage moved through the dark countryside. She did not know where they were going, She did not know what would be expected of her once they arrived. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to feel something other than dread. She allowed herself to feel hope, fragile and uncertain but real. Outside the carriage window, the lights of the town faded behind them, and ahead, somewhere in the darkness, waited a future Alara could not yet imagine, one that would test everything she believed about herself, about love, and about the price of being chosen by someone the whole world had thought unreachable. The carriage rolled on, carrying her toward it, one turn of the wheels at a time. The carriage arrived at Camden Manor well past midnight, and Alara stepped out into a courtyard lit by lanterns hanging from iron posts. The house rose before her, enormous and silent, its windows dark except for a single glow on the ground floor. She had grown up hearing stories about the Camden estate, tales exaggerated by townsfolk who had never actually seen it, and yet nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale of the place, the way it seemed to stretch endlessly into the night sky. "You will stay in the East Wing," Alastair said, guiding her toward the entrance. "My housekeeper, Beatrice, has prepared a room for you. Tomorrow we will speak properly once you have rested." Alara nodded, too exhausted and too overwhelmed to form a coherent response. A woman with silver hair and a kind, weathered face met them at the door, introducing herself as Beatrice before leading Alara up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The room she was shown into was larger than the entire cottage Alara had shared with her stepmother and stepsisters. A fire had already been lit in the hearth, and a nightgown far finer than anything Alara owned had been laid across the bed. "His Grace said you should want for nothing," Beatrice said, her tone gentle but curious, studying Alara with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Sleep well, miss. Tomorrow will bring answers, I imagine." Sleep did not come easily. Alara lay awake for hours, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, replaying the events of the evening again and again. She thought of the auctioneer's gavel, of her stepmother's furious face, of the Duke's steady hand guiding her down from the platform. None of it made sense, and the lack of answers gnawed at her more than exhaustion ever could. When she finally drifted into sleep, her dreams were filled with whispered questions she could not answer. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through heavy curtains, and a young maid named Clara knocked softly before entering with a tray of breakfast. Alara ate slowly, still half convinced she would wake to find herself back in her old room, the auction nothing more than a strange and vivid dream. But the food was real, the silk of the borrowed dressing gown was real, and when Clara informed her that His Grace requested her company in the garden, Alara understood that whatever this was, it was not going to disappear simply because she wished to understand it first. She found Alastair standing near a stone fountain, dressed more simply than he had been the night before, his coat replaced by a plain waistcoat that made him look, for a moment, almost approachable. He turned as she approached, and something in his expression eased slightly, as though he had been uncertain whether she would come at all. "I imagine you have questions," he said, gesturing toward a bench beneath a flowering tree. "I have many," Alara admitted, sitting carefully at the edge of the bench, keeping a respectful distance between them. "Chief among them, why me? There were dozens of women at that auction far better suited to catch a duke's attention. I am neither wealthy nor beautiful nor accomplished in any way that would interest someone like you." Alastair studied her for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced charm she had expected from a man of his position. "For 3 years, I have avoided every social event in this county, because every single one of them was arranged for the same purpose. Families paraded their daughters before me like prized livestock, each one trained to laugh at my jokes and admire my title and pretend they found me fascinating rather than simply wealthy. I grew tired of it. I grew tired of being wanted only for what I could provide. And you believe the auction would be different." "I did not attend the auction expecting anything," he said. I attended because a friend insisted the proceeds would help the orphanage, and I owed him a favor. I intended to make a donation and leave before the bidding even began. But then I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to look away, refusing to let the whole room's cruelty break you, and something about it struck me. You were not performing. You were not trying to be admired. You were simply enduring something unbearable with more dignity than I have seen from anyone in years. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being spoken of in such terms. That is not dignity, Your Grace. That is simply having no other choice. Perhaps, he said, but I have watched a great many people crumble when they had no other choice, and you did not. That is not nothing. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle trickle of water from the fountain. Alara studied his face, searching for some sign of insincerity, some hidden motive she had not yet uncovered. She found none, though she reminded herself that men of wealth and position were often skilled at hiding exactly what they wished to hide. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "I cannot imagine you intend for me to simply live here indefinitely." "For now," Alastair said, "I would like you to accompany me to the season's opening ball, as agreed at the auction. Beyond that, I have made no decisions, and I do not expect you to either. I only ask that you give this a fair chance before deciding it is some cruel trick, because I promise you, it is not." Alara considered his words carefully. She thought of returning to her stepmother's house, to the cramped attic room she had slept in for years, to the endless chores and the constant reminders of her own unworthiness. She thought of the alternative now being offered to her, uncertain and strange as it was, and found that despite every instinct urging caution, she was not ready to walk away from it. "Very well," she said. "I will attend the ball with you, but I want you to understand, Your Grace, that I have no interest in being paraded about as an oddity for society to gossip over. If that is what this becomes, I will leave, regardless of what arrangement was made at the auction." Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "That is fair," he said, "and you may call me Alastair, at least when we are not in company. I find the constant reminder of my title exhausting." Over the following days, Alara found herself settling into a strange new rhythm at Camden Manor. She spent mornings with Beatrice, learning the customs and expectations of the household, and afternoons walking the extensive gardens, sometimes alone, sometimes in Alastair's company. She discovered, gradually, that the man behind the intimidating title was quieter and more thoughtful than the rumors had suggested, prone to long silences and careful observations, rather than the arrogant dismissiveness she had expected. He asked her questions no one had ever bothered asking before: what she enjoyed reading, what she thought of the political debates currently dividing the townsfolk, what she wanted for her own life, if circumstances had never forced her into her stepmother's household. Alara found herself answering honestly, surprised by how easily the words came once she realized he was actually listening, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. In turn, she learned pieces of his own story. His father, the previous duke, had been a demanding and often cold man, more concerned with the estate's reputation than with his son's happiness. Alastair had spent years being groomed for a role he had never particularly wanted, surrounded by people who valued him only for the title he would eventually inherit. His mother had died when he was young, and he spoke of her only briefly, though Alara noticed the way his voice softened whenever her name arose. "You understand something about being unwanted, then," Alara said one afternoon, as they walked along a path lined with rose bushes just beginning to bloom. "Even with all this," she gestured at the manor rising behind them, "you understand what it means to feel invisible in your own home." Alastair was quiet for a long moment. "I had never thought of it that way," he admitted, "but yes, I suppose I do." News of Alara's presence at Camden Manor had, inevitably, spread through the surrounding towns within days. Word traveled quickly among servants and merchants, and soon enough it reached her stepmother's household, carried by a gossiping neighbor eager to share the scandal. Margaret's fury upon hearing the news was, according to Clara, who had relatives working in the Whitmore household, a thing to behold. She had spent years insisting Alara was worthless, and now the entire county was whispering about how the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe had chosen her above every eligible woman in the region. Alara tried not to think too much about her stepmother's reaction, though a small, uncharitable part of her could not help but feel a flicker of satisfaction at the thought. She had spent so many years being told she was nothing, that she deserved nothing, that the sudden reversal felt almost too strange to fully believe. But not everyone in society greeted the news with the same curiosity as the servants and townsfolk. At a small gathering hosted by a local baron, Alara was introduced, for the first time, to Lady Vivienne Ashworth, a striking young woman with pale golden hair and an expression of carefully controlled disdain. Vivienne had, according to whispers Alara overheard before the introduction, spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the most likely candidate to eventually become the next Duchess of Ashcombe. "How delightful," Vivienne said, her smile sharp despite its politeness, "to finally meet the woman who caused such a stir at the charity auction. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, how does it feel to be such an unexpected surprise?" "I am not entirely certain what you mean, my lady," Alara replied carefully, sensing the venom hidden beneath the pleasant tone. "Only that it must be quite an adjustment," Vivienne continued, moving from a seamstress's modest life to the halls of Camden Manor. "I do hope you are prepared for the scrutiny that comes with such attention. Society can be rather unforgiving of those who rise too quickly, without the proper background to support it." Alastair, who had been engaged in conversation nearby, appeared at Alara's side before she could formulate a response, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes held a warning as he looked at Vivienne. "Lady Ashworth," he said, "I believe the musicians are about to begin. Perhaps you should find your seat." Vivienne's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered behind her eyes as she excused herself and moved toward the ballroom's far side. Alara watched her go, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the crowded room or the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. "You should be careful of her," Alastair said quietly, once Vivienne was out of earshot. "She does not take rejection gracefully, and I fear she has decided you are the reason her plans have gone astray." "What plans?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "For the better part of a year, her family has made it clear they expected an eventual match between us," Alastair said. "I never encouraged it, but that has not stopped Vivienne from behaving as though it were already decided. I would ask that you be cautious around her, Alara. She is not someone who accepts losing quietly." Alara nodded, though the warning did little to ease the discomfort settling over her. She had grown accustomed to her stepmother's cruelty, had learned to navigate it through years of practice. But this was different, a new kind of danger, dressed in silk and pearls, smiling sweetly while calculating exactly how to unravel everything Alara had begun, cautiously, to hope for. As the evening wore on and the musicians filled the ballroom with music, Alara found herself dancing with Alastair for the first time, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers as they moved across the floor. For a few precious minutes, she forgot about Vivienne's cold smile, forgot about her stepmother's fury, forgot about every doubt that had followed her since the auction. She simply allowed herself, for once, to feel something close to happiness. But across the room, watching them with an expression that had hardened into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy, Vivienne Ashworth was already beginning to plan. Weeks passed, and Alara's life at Camden Manor settled into something that almost resembled comfort, though a persistent wariness never fully left her. She had learned from years of hard experience that comfort was often the calm before a storm, and she found herself watching for signs of the cruelty she had come to expect, even as Alistair continued to treat her with nothing but patience and genuine interest. Their conversations grew longer, their walks through the gardens more frequent, and slowly, carefully, Alara allowed herself to lower the walls she had built around her heart. She told him, one evening by the fire in the manor's smaller sitting room, about her father, a kind but often absent merchant who had died suddenly when she was 15, leaving her at the mercy of a stepmother who had never wanted her in the household to begin with. "He used to tell me stories," Alara said, staring into the flames rather than at Alistair, finding it easier to speak of painful things without meeting his eyes. "About faraway places he had traveled for his business. I used to imagine, someday, I might see some of them myself. After he died, Margaret made it very clear that such dreams were not meant for someone in my position." "What position is that?" Alistair asked gently. "An unwanted burden," Alara said, the words leaving her mouth before she could soften them. "She has 2 daughters of her own, Prudence and Charlotte, and from the moment my father passed, I understood exactly where I ranked among the household's priorities. I was given the smallest room, the oldest clothes, and more chores than I could count. When Prudence or Charlotte made mistakes, I was blamed. When they succeeded, I was reminded how unlikely it was that I would ever manage the same." Alistair's jaw tightened, though his voice remained gentle. "That is not a life anyone should have to endure, least of all a child." "It was not so terrible in comparison to what others endure," Alara said quickly, an old habit of minimizing her own suffering rising unbidden. "I had food and shelter and—" "Alara," Alistair interrupted, his tone firm but kind, "you do not need to make excuses for the way you were treated. Cruelty does not become acceptable simply because someone else's cruelty was worse." She fell silent, unused to being told that her own pain mattered, that she was allowed to acknowledge it without immediately diminishing it. Something in her chest loosened slightly, a knot she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked quietly. "My past, my stepmother's treatment of me, why do you care about any of it?" Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, before he finally spoke. "Because I understand, better than most, what it feels like to be surrounded by people who claim to care for you while treating you as though your feelings are irrelevant. My father never struck me, never denied me food or shelter, and yet I spent my entire childhood understanding that I mattered only insofar as I could fulfill his expectations. When I failed to meet them, I was reminded, in careful, cutting words, exactly how disappointing I was." "I did not know that," Alara said softly. "Few people do," Alistair replied. "It is not the sort of thing dukes are meant to admit. We are expected to be strong, capable, entirely without weakness. But I recognized something in you, Alara, that night at the auction. Not weakness, but a kind of quiet strength I had not encountered before, born from surviving exactly the kind of treatment I understood far too well myself." The fire crackled softly between them, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence carrying more warmth than words could have provided. Alara felt something shift inside her chest, something fragile and hopeful that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She was beginning, cautiously, to believe that whatever this was between them, it might be real. But not everyone shared her growing hope. Lady Vivienne Ashworth had spent the week since their first meeting carefully gathering information, speaking with servants, merchants, and anyone else who might possess useful knowledge about Alara's past. She was patient, methodical, and utterly convinced that a woman like Alara Whitmore, plain and poor and entirely without proper breeding, had no business standing where Vivienne herself had spent years positioning herself to stand. It was during a visit to a neighboring estate, weeks after the ball, that Vivienne finally found what she had been searching for. A distant cousin of Margaret Whitmore's, eager to gossip and unaware of the damage her words might cause, mentioned offhandedly that Alara's father had died deeply in debt, his business ventures having failed spectacularly in his final years, and that rumors had once circulated, unproven but persistent, suggesting his death had not been entirely accidental. Vivienne seized upon the story eagerly, embellishing it in the retelling until the vague, unconfirmed rumor transformed into something far more damaging, a tale suggesting Alara's father had taken his own life to escape mounting debts and disgrace, leaving his daughter to grow up under the shadow of scandal and dishonesty. It did not matter to Vivienne whether the story was true. It mattered only that it was damaging enough to unravel everything Alara had begun building at Camden Manor. Alara remained unaware of the rumor taking shape behind her back, too occupied with the growing warmth of her relationship with Alistair to notice the careful whispers beginning to circulate through the drawing rooms and dinner parties of the county's finer families. She spent her days learning the responsibilities that would someday accompany the title of Duchess, studying alongside Beatrice, who had taken to the task of educating her with evident enthusiasm and genuine affection. "You have a natural instinct for this," Beatrice told her one afternoon as they reviewed the household ledgers together. "More than I expected, given your background. Many young women born to privilege struggle with practical matters far more than you do." "I spent years managing my stepmother's household accounts," Alara admitted. "It seems those skills were not entirely wasted after all." Beatrice smiled warmly. "Nothing you have endured has been wasted, my dear. His Grace sees that in you, and I confess, so do I." Such moments of genuine kindness had become increasingly common in Alara's new life, and she found herself, gradually, beginning to trust that perhaps this was not some elaborate trick destined to collapse the moment she let her guard down. She began to imagine, cautiously, a future she had never dared consider before, one where she was valued rather than tolerated, cherished rather than endured. That fragile hope was tested sooner than she expected. At a dinner hosted by one of the county's more prominent families, Alara found herself seated near several women she did not recognize, their conversation polite on the surface, but laced with an undercurrent of curiosity that made her uneasy. She caught fragments of whispered exchanges, her name mentioned alongside words like debt and scandal and father, though whenever she turned to address the speakers directly, the conversation shifted smoothly to safer topics. It was not until later that evening, as she and Alistair rode home together in the carriage, that she finally worked up the courage to voice her growing unease. "Something is happening," she said quietly, watching the dark countryside pass outside the window. "I do not know exactly what, but people are speaking about me differently than before. Whispers I cannot quite catch, glances that stop the moment I notice them." Alistair's expression grew serious. "What sort of whispers?" "Something about my father," Alara said. "Debt, perhaps. I did not hear enough to understand fully, but I recognized the particular way people were looking at me. I have seen that look before, growing up in Margaret's household. It is the look people give someone they believe carries some hidden shame." Alistair's jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing his features before he carefully composed himself. "I will look into this," he said. "Whatever is being said, Alara, I promise you, we will address it directly. I will not allow baseless rumors to poison what we have built here." "What if they are not entirely baseless?" Alara asked quietly, an old fear resurfacing, one she had never voiced aloud to anyone. "My father's business did fail, toward the end. He died suddenly, and Margaret never spoke of the details beyond insisting his failures had left us with nothing. I do not actually know the full truth of what happened in his final months." "Then we will find out together," Alistair said firmly, reaching across the carriage to take her hand in his. "Whatever the truth is, Alara, it does not change who you are now or what you have overcome. I need you to understand that." Alara nodded, though the uncertainty lingered, a small, cold knot forming in her stomach that no amount of reassurance could fully dissolve. She trusted Alistair's words, trusted the sincerity behind them, but she had learned, through years of disappointment, that good intentions did not always survive contact with the harsher realities of the world. Over the following days, Alastair made careful inquiries, sending trusted associates to investigate the circumstances surrounding her father's death and the collapse of his business. What they discovered was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Her father, it seemed, had indeed accumulated significant debts in his final years, the result of a series of poor investments made in partnership with a business associate who had ultimately abandoned him when the ventures began to fail. He had died of a sudden illness, entirely unrelated to the rumors of self-inflicted harm that Vivienne had so carefully cultivated. But the debts themselves had been very real, and Margaret, it turned out, had spent years quietly working to repay them while simultaneously blaming Alara for the family's diminished circumstances. "She let me believe I was a burden," Alara said, once Alastair shared the findings with her, sitting together in the manor's private study. "She let me believe my father had left us with nothing, that I contributed nothing when in truth she was struggling under debts he left behind, debts that had nothing to do with me at all. It seems your stepmother found it convenient to have someone to blame," Alastair said gently. "Rather than confront the difficulty of her own circumstances honestly, she directed her frustration toward you, someone with no power to defend herself against such treatment." Alara absorbed this information slowly, feeling old wounds reopening even as new understanding began to settle into place. Years of guilt, of believing herself somehow responsible for her family's misfortune, began to crumble under the weight of the truth. She was not a burden. She had never been a burden. She had simply been a convenient target for a woman unwilling to face her own struggles honestly. "Thank you," she said finally, meeting Alastair's eyes, "for finding this, for believing me enough to look." "I would do far more than this for you," Alastair said quietly, and something in his tone made Alara's heart quicken in a way she had not expected. But even as the truth about her father's death offered some measure of peace, the rumors themselves continued to spread through society, twisted further with each retelling, and Vivienne, undeterred by the investigation's findings, had already begun planning her next move, one designed not merely to embarrass Alara, but to end, once and for all, any possibility of her becoming the next Duchess of Ashcombe. The season's grandest ball, hosted at Camden Manor itself, was fast approaching, and Vivienne understood that such a public setting, filled with every family of consequence in the county, would offer the perfect opportunity to deliver a blow from which Alara would not easily recover. Alara, unaware of the full scope of what awaited her, spent the days leading up to the ball focused on preparations, on fittings for a new gown far finer than anything she had ever worn, on final lessons with Beatrice regarding the proper conduct expected of a woman soon to be formally introduced to society as the Duke's intended companion. She allowed herself, cautiously, to feel excitement rather than dread, believing the worst of the rumors had already passed, that the truth uncovered about her father would be enough to silence any remaining whispers. She did not yet know how wrong she was. On the morning of the ball, as Clara helped her dress, Alara caught her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not immediately search for flaws. She saw, instead, a woman who had endured more than most people ever would, who had survived cruelty and grief and years of feeling unwanted, and who now stood on the edge of a future that promised, finally, something better. She had no way of knowing that by the end of the evening, everything she had built over these past weeks would hang in the balance, threatened by a lie so carefully constructed that even those who loved her most would struggle to see through it in time. The ballroom at Camden Manor had been transformed for the occasion, hundreds of candles casting warm light across polished floors, musicians tuning their instruments in the corner, and servants moving quietly among the arriving guests with trays of refreshments. Alara stood near the top of the grand staircase, her new gown a deep shade of blue that Beatrice had insisted suited her far better than the pale colors society typically favored for young, unmarried women. For the first time since arriving at Camden Manor, she felt something close to confidence, as she prepared to descend into the crowd below. Alistair waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, and the expression on his face when he saw her, something between admiration and quiet wonder, settled the last of her nerves. He extended his hand as she reached the final step, and together they moved into the ballroom, greeted by a wave of curious glances and murmured conversation that had, by now, become familiar to her. The evening began well. Alara danced, spoke with guests who had begun, cautiously, to warm toward her, and allowed herself to enjoy the music and the warmth of the crowded room. She caught sight of Vivienne Ashworth several times throughout the evening, always watching from a careful distance, her expression pleasant but her eyes calculating in a way that made Alara's earlier unease return, however much she tried to dismiss it as simple wariness born from past experience. It was during a brief pause in the dancing, as guests gathered near the refreshment tables to catch their breath, that Vivienne finally made her move. She approached a small cluster of prominent society women, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, and began speaking of Alara's past with a tone of feigned sympathy that fooled no one paying close attention. "It is truly tragic," Vivienne said, "what that poor girl endured. I understand her father took his own life, unable to face the shame of his failed business dealings, leaving her and her stepmother buried beneath debts they could never hope to repay. One can hardly blame her for seeking out a wealthy match, given such desperate circumstances, though I do wonder whether His Grace fully understands the extent of what he has taken on." The words spread through the ballroom with alarming speed, whispered from group to group, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until by the time they reached Alara's ears, the story had transformed into something far uglier than even Vivienne's original fabrication, suggesting Alara had deliberately schemed to trap the Duke into marriage, using a carefully constructed sob story to manipulate his sympathy. Alara felt the room's atmosphere shift around her, the warm curiosity of earlier replaced by something colder, more judgmental. Conversation stopped abruptly when she approached, eyes followed her with new scrutiny, and she understood with sinking certainty that whatever fragile acceptance she had built over the past weeks was crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of Vivienne's carefully orchestrated lie. "Alara," Alistair said, appearing at her side, his expression tense, "something is happening. I need you to tell me what you have heard." "They are saying my father took his own life," Alara said quietly, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts to remain composed. "That I schemed to secure your affection using a fabricated story of hardship. Alistair, none of this is true, I swear to you, I never." "I know," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I know it is not true. We uncovered the truth together, remember. But knowledge and rumor do not always move at the same speed, and I fear someone has been working very deliberately to ensure this particular lie spreads as quickly and as widely as possible." Across the room, Alara caught sight of her stepmother, Margaret, who had been invited as a matter of courtesy given her connection to Alara, standing near the edge of the crowd with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. Whether Margaret herself had contributed to the rumor's spread or simply relished watching it unfold, Alara could not be certain, though the cold indifference in her stepmother's eyes told her everything she needed to know about where her loyalties lay. "I should leave," Alara said, panic rising in her chest as more eyes turned toward her as the whispers grew louder, more pointed. "This will only grow worse the longer I remain." "No," Alistair said firmly. "Running will only confirm whatever suspicions they now hold. We will face this together, Alara. I will not allow you to be driven from this house by lies." But before either of them could decide how best to address the growing crisis, the matter was taken entirely out of their hands. A distant relative of Margaret's, the same woman who had originally, innocently, shared the story of her father's debts with Vivienne weeks earlier, approached the couple with an expression of genuine distress, having heard the twisted version of her own words circulating through the ballroom. "Your Grace," the woman said, curtsying nervously before Alistair, I fear a terrible misunderstanding has occurred, and I believe I am partially responsible. Might I have a word in private to explain what I actually said and to whom?" Alastair agreed immediately, and the woman, whose name was Henrietta, explained in halting, apologetic tones how she had mentioned Alara's father's financial troubles to Lady Vivienne several weeks prior, never imagining her words would be twisted into such a damaging and entirely false narrative. She had heard nothing about any accusation of self-inflicted death, nothing about any scheme on Alara's part, and was horrified to learn how far her innocent comment had traveled from its original truth. "Would you be willing to say as much, publicly?" Alastair asked. "I understand this places you in an uncomfortable position, but the truth deserves to be heard as clearly as the lie has been." Henrietta hesitated only a moment before nodding firmly. "It is the least I can do, given the harm my careless words have caused." What followed was one of the most tense moments Alara had ever experienced. Alastair called for the musicians to pause, requesting the attention of the assembled guests with a calm authority that silenced the ballroom almost instantly. He explained, briefly and without dramatics, that a false and damaging rumor had begun circulating regarding Alara's family history, and that he intended to address it directly rather than allow it to fester unchallenged. Henrietta, though visibly nervous, stepped forward and explained honestly what she had actually shared weeks earlier, confirming that Alara's father had died of sudden illness, not by his own hand, and that no scheme or manipulation had ever been part of Alara's circumstances. The room listened in tense silence, and Alara felt her heart pounding as every eye once again turned toward her, though this time the scrutiny carried a different weight, uncertain rather than judgmental. "I have conducted my own inquiries into Miss Whitmore's history," Alastair continued, once Henrietta had finished. "Her father did leave behind significant debts, the result of failed business ventures and a dishonest partner who abandoned him when circumstances grew difficult. Her death was sudden from illness, entirely unrelated to any scandal. Whatever additional details have been added to this story since were fabricated deliberately by someone seeking to cause harm." His gaze moved deliberately across the crowd until it settled on Vivienne, who stood frozen near the refreshment table, her carefully composed expression finally cracking under the weight of open accusation. Murmurs spread through the crowd once more, though this time directed toward her rather than toward Alara. "I do not know why you chose to twist an innocent conversation into something so damaging," Alastair said, addressing Vivienne directly, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge of anger. "But I would ask that in the future, you direct your energy toward matters that do not involve destroying the reputation of someone who has done nothing to deserve such treatment." Vivienne's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated under the collective judgment of the room. She offered no defense, no explanation, simply turning and making her way quickly toward the exit, her carefully cultivated social standing crumbling with each step she took away from the gathered crowd. Alara stood frozen through the entire exchange, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from public humiliation to public vindication, uncertain how to process the whiplash of emotions crashing through her. When Alastair finally turned back to her, his expression softening from the controlled anger he had shown Vivienne into something far gentler, she felt tears she had been holding back finally threaten to spill over. "You did not have to do that," she whispered, once he had guided her away from the curious crowd toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "In front of everyone, you could have simply let it fade quietly." "I could have," Alastair agreed. "But I did not want you to spend even one more moment believing you had to hide, or apologize, or shrink yourself to fit whatever cruel narrative someone else decided to construct about you. You deserve to hear the truth spoken clearly, in front of everyone who had doubted you." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for the calculation she had once expected to find in every kind gesture, the hidden motive, the eventual cruelty she had spent years learning to anticipate. She found none, only steady, unwavering sincerity. "Thank you," she said softly. "You do not need to thank me," Alastair replied. "I only wish I had discovered what was happening sooner, before it caused you this much distress." The remainder of the ball passed differently than its beginning had promised. Guests who had whispered cruel speculation only an hour earlier now approached Alara with careful, if somewhat awkward, apologies, and though she accepted them graciously, she could not quite shake the awareness of how quickly the room's opinion had turned against her, and how quickly it had turned back, dependent entirely on whichever version of her story seemed most convincing at the time. Margaret, for her part, made no attempt to approach Alara for the remainder of the evening, and when their eyes met briefly across the room near the night's end, Alara saw something in her stepmother's expression that might have been the beginning of shame, though it vanished too quickly for her to be entirely certain. As the ball finally began winding down and guests started making their way toward waiting carriages, Alara found herself standing once more beside the fountain in the garden where she and Alastair had first spoken honestly weeks earlier. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of the flowering trees, and above them, stars scattered across a clear sky. "This evening did not unfold as either of us hoped," Alastair said, joining her by the fountain's edge. "No," Alara agreed, "but perhaps it needed to happen this way. Perhaps I needed to see, clearly, exactly how quickly this world can turn against someone like me, and exactly how far you were willing to go to defend me regardless." "I will always defend you," Alastair said quietly. "Whatever comes next, whatever other lies someone might attempt to spread, I need you to understand that my commitment to you does not waver based on society's fickle opinions." Alara turned to face him fully, searching his eyes one final time for any trace of doubt, and finding only steady certainty staring back at her. Whatever Vivienne's scheme had intended to accomplish, it had achieved the opposite effect, revealing not weakness in their bond, but its strength, tested publicly and found unshakable. But even as the immediate crisis passed, Alara understood that the true test of everything they had built together still lay ahead, waiting in the days and weeks to come, when the whispers would inevitably resume, when society would continue searching for reasons to doubt her worthiness, and when she would need to decide, once and for all, whether she believed herself deserving of the life now being offered to her. In the weeks following the ball, the rumors surrounding Alara's past faded quickly, replaced by a new narrative that spread just as rapidly through the county's drawing rooms, one that painted her as a woman of remarkable resilience who had endured hardship and cruelty, only to find genuine happiness through her own quiet strength. Alara found the sudden reversal almost as unsettling as the earlier cruelty had been, uncomfortable with how easily society's opinion could shift from scorn to admiration, based on nothing more than which story happened to be circulating at any given moment. Vivienne Ashworth had left the county entirely within days of the ball, her family relocating to distant relatives, rather than face the ongoing scrutiny and social consequences of her exposed scheme. Alara felt no satisfaction in her rival's downfall, only a quiet relief that the danger had passed, and a lingering sadness at the thought of how much energy Vivienne had spent trying to destroy something she had never even fully understood. Margaret, meanwhile, made one final attempt to reassert some control over the situation, arriving unannounced at Camden Manor several weeks after the ball, demanding an audience with Alara under the pretense of family concern. Alara agreed to see her, though she insisted on meeting in the manor's smaller sitting room rather than anywhere more private, uncertain what her stepmother intended and unwilling to be caught alone with her without witnesses nearby. "You have done well for yourself," Margaret said, settling into a chair with the same critical, appraising expression Alara remembered from years of similar exchanges. "Better than I ever expected, certainly." "Is that why you have come?" Alara asked. "To acknowledge as much?" Margaret's expression flickered, something almost like discomfort crossing her features before her usual composure reasserted itself. I have come because you are still, whatever has changed, a member of this family, and I believed it appropriate to offer my congratulations on your upcoming engagement, given the rumors currently circulating. There is no engagement yet, Alara said carefully, only an understanding between His Grace and myself. Of course, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe the distinction mattered. Regardless, I hope you understand, Alara, that whatever occurred between us over the years, I always intended what was best for this family. Alara studied her stepmother carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the carefully chosen words, and found instead the same self-serving justification Margaret had always offered for her treatment of the daughter who was never truly wanted. She understood, finally, with a clarity that had taken years to achieve, that Margaret would never offer a genuine apology, would never acknowledge the specific cruelties inflicted over so many years, because doing so would require confronting a version of herself she was unwilling to face. I believe you intended what was best for yourself and your own daughters, Alara said quietly, without anger, simply stating what she now understood to be true. That is not the same as intending what was best for this family as a whole, and certainly not the same as intending what was best for me. Margaret's face tightened, though she offered no denial. I did what circumstances required. Perhaps, Alara said, but I no longer need to carry the weight of believing myself responsible for those circumstances, or grateful for whatever scraps of consideration you occasionally offered. I have built something new now, something entirely separate from everything you taught me to believe about my own worth. The conversation ended shortly after, with Margaret departing Camden Manor without any further acknowledgement of the years of harm she had caused, though Alara found, somewhat to her surprise, that she no longer needed such acknowledgement to move forward. She had spent so long waiting for her stepmother's approval, her validation, that releasing the need for it entirely felt like setting down a weight she had carried for far too long. Alastair, who had waited outside the sitting room throughout the exchange, found her afterward standing quietly by the garden fountain, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. "How did it go?" he asked, settling beside her. "About as I expected," Alara said. She offered no real apology, only a careful acknowledgement that I had, against all her expectations, managed to succeed despite everything she did to ensure otherwise. "I am sorry," Alastair said, "that you did not receive what you deserved from her." "I think," Alara said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "that I no longer need anything from her at all. For years I believed her opinion of me determined my worth, that if I could only prove myself enough, work hard enough, endure enough, she might finally see value in me. But I understand now that her inability to see it was never about my worth at all. It was about her own limitations, her own choices, her own unwillingness to treat a grieving child with basic kindness." Alastair reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You have grown remarkably wise in the short time I have known you. I have had considerable practice surviving circumstances that demanded it," Alara said, though a small smile tugged at her lips, the first genuine lightness she had felt since her stepmother's unexpected visit. As the weeks continued to pass, Alara found herself increasingly comfortable in her new life, no longer bracing constantly for the next cruelty, the next humiliation, the next reminder of her supposed unworthiness. She threw herself into learning the responsibilities that would eventually accompany her role as Duchess, discovering a genuine passion for the charitable work Alastair's family had long supported, particularly the very orphanage whose fundraising auction had brought them together in the first place. She visited the orphanage regularly, bringing supplies, spending time with the children, listening to their stories with the particular understanding of someone who had once felt just as unwanted and overlooked as they sometimes did. The children, in turn, adored her, drawn to her genuine warmth, and the way she never spoke to them with the condescension so many wealthy visitors could not help but display. "You have a gift for this," Alastair observed one afternoon, watching her patiently teach a young girl to read from a worn storybook. "The children trust you in a way I have rarely seen them trust anyone." "They recognize something familiar in me, I think," Alara said. "The particular loneliness of feeling unwanted. I understand it better than most, and perhaps that understanding allows me to offer them something more genuine than simple charity." It was during one such visit to the orphanage, several months after the ball, that Alastair finally asked the question Alara had begun, cautiously, to hope for. They had walked together afterward through the same garden where their earliest conversations had unfolded, and as the sun began setting behind the manor's distant hills, Alastair stopped beside the fountain and turned to face her fully. "Alara," he said, and something in his voice, uncharacteristically uncertain, made her heart quicken immediately. "When I attended that auction, months ago, I told myself I was simply fulfilling an obligation to a friend, making a donation to a worthy cause before returning to the solitary life I had grown accustomed to. I did not expect to find anyone there who might change my understanding of what I actually wanted from my life." "Alastair," Alara began, but he continued before she could say more. "I have watched you endure cruelty with more grace than I believed possible," he said. "I have watched you rebuild your understanding of your own worth, piece by piece, despite everyone who spent years trying to convince you otherwise. I have watched you offer kindness to children who remind you painfully of your own difficult childhood, rather than allowing that pain to harden you against them. And somewhere in these past months, I have come to understand that I do not simply admire you, Alara. I love you completely, and I would very much like to spend the remainder of my life proving that to you, if you will allow it." He knelt then, producing a small velvet box from his coat pocket, and Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried none of the pain that had so often accompanied her tears in the past. This was something else entirely, something warm and overwhelming and entirely unfamiliar. "I am not asking you to marry me because of some arrangement made at an auction," Alastair continued. "I am asking because I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Alara Whitmore, will you marry me?" Alara looked down at him, at the man who had walked into a small country auction hall and chosen, of every woman present, the one everyone else had decided was worth nothing at all, who had defended her publicly when her reputation hung in the balance, who had listened patiently to every painful piece of her history without once making her feel diminished by it. She thought of the girl who had stood on that platform months earlier, certain she was unworthy of anything beyond quiet endurance, and understood how far she had traveled since that humiliating evening. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now falling freely. "Yes, I will marry you." Alastair rose and pulled her into an embrace, and for a long moment they simply stood together beside the fountain, the last light of evening settling gently around them. Alara allowed herself, finally, completely, to believe in the future unfolding before her, a future built not on obligation or convenience, but on genuine understanding and hard-won trust. Their wedding, held the following spring, was a grand affair, attended by every family of consequence throughout the county. Though Alara insisted on including guests few others of her new station would have considered appropriate, including several children from the orphanage, dressed in their finest clothes and seated near the front of the ceremony. Beatrice, who had become something between a mentor and a dear friend over the preceding months, wept openly throughout the vows, and even Clara, who had known Alara since her earliest, most uncertain days at Camden Manor, could not hide her own emotion at witnessing how far her mistress had come. Margaret attended, though she remained at the edges of the celebration, offering only stiff congratulations before departing early, unable, it seemed, to fully witness the culmination of everything she had once insisted would never come to pass for her overlooked stepdaughter. Alara felt no anger toward her by that point, only a quiet, settled peace, understanding that her own happiness no longer depended in any way on her stepmother's approval or presence. As Alara stood beside Alistair that evening, now truly and completely his wife, surrounded by the genuine warmth of those who had come to know and value her for exactly who she was, she thought back to the girl who had once stood trembling on an auction platform, certain of her own worthlessness, convinced that no one would ever choose her over anyone else in the room. That girl had been wrong, she understood now, not because a duke's wealth or title had somehow transformed her into someone worthy of love, but because she had always been worthy, long before Alistair Camden ever walked through those hall doors. It had simply taken someone willing to look past the world's careless judgment to finally see the truth that had been there all along. The mocking laughter of that long-ago evening had faded entirely from memory, replaced instead by the warm, genuine joy of a life finally, completely her own, chosen not out of pity or obligation, but out of love freely given and gratefully received.